Our scripture reading this morning will be Psalm 103, verses 1 through 5. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good so that your youth is renewed like the eagles.
All right, good morning. Good to see you guys all here today. It's always a blessing to be together and worship our God and think about the things that he has done for us, and I appreciate Colin reading that scripture, and I want you to keep that in your mind as we go through this lesson here in the next coming minutes and consider all that God has done for us and so much that we have to bless his holy and righteous and powerful name in our lives. We are continuing our series in the book of Romans in the idea of faith, obedience, and unity in a divided world. Our world is certainly divided today in many different ways and principles and areas, including our own country. And it really was no different in the first century when Paul wrote this letter to the church, to our brothers and sisters in the great city of Rome in the Roman Empire. It was a divided world. There were Romans and there were non-Romans. There were, if you will, Greek-cultured people, and there were barbarians. There were Jews and there were Gentiles, and then now, coming into the world, there were disciples of Jesus, the Messiah. And that is a brand new component that was brought into the world, but it certainly changed the world for the better and forever. And that is a bit of the division of the world in which these Christians were living and striving to please God and glorify him in their lives, as we do today. And these posed challenges to doing that. And last week we looked at chapter 6, in which Paul is stressing the need to let grace reign. The law is not reigning. Sin cannot reign because grace must reign. And if you remember, it was because he said that we as Christians have all died to sin through baptism. We have been joined with Christ in his death and ultimately in his resurrection when we are buried in those waters and are brought up out of them to walk in newness of life and to let grace reign and no longer let sin reign in our lives. And that life, the liberty that we now have in grace, and the pursuit of holiness, to strive to be more like Jesus in our lives and to get closer and closer to him every single day. That is and should be an aim of all disciples of Jesus. Well, into chapter 7, as we are getting into today, I would like you to open up to Romans chapter 7. Paul is continuing this thought, and without taking a breath, seemingly, he is continuing this urge and this need to let grace reign. Let grace reign. And here in chapter 7, one of the ways that he is going to express the importance of this is by showing us that we are bound to Jesus. We are bound to Christ. And so that's why we must let grace reign. It's because we are joined, we are bound to Christ. And there are three key components to this that I would like us to notice in the time that we have today. To let grace reign, that we are bound to Christ in Romans chapter 7. The first is indeed that binding, that we are bound to Jesus. And he's going to go into verse 1 in Romans chapter 7 to discuss. He says, "Or do you not know, brethren, for I am speaking to those who know the law." Our clicker is, maybe it's out of batteries, But could you change the next slide, Jackson? He says, or do you not know, brethren, okay, speaking to Christians, and if you remember, for several chapters now, he is really directing his words to Jewish Christians. These were formerly Jews, okay, those who grew up with the law. They kept the law, just like Paul did. And so now he is telling them, I'm speaking to you, those of you who know the law. Okay, and you know all the components of the law, from the ceremonies to the holidays to the Sabbaths, and in particular here, he's going to touch on the part of the law in an indirect way that would speak to marriage. He's going to go on here to say that in the law, that there is a teaching and a commandment, if you will, that you are bound to your wife, to your spouse, as long as that spouse is living. This is something that really was the original way that God had designed marriage. Amen. In fact, when Jesus was asked by some of the people that were in the crowd amongst him when he was teaching, they tried to catch him in different ways. There were different rabbis who had different thoughts. Hillel, Shammai, and some others who said that in one camp, there were disciples of different rabbis, just like we are disciples of Jesus. Jesus was a rabbi, he was a teacher. Well, so there were different rabbis as well in the first century who would, seemingly in a political way perhaps, come up with different practices and teachings, maybe to grow their schools and their disciples. And one of those areas was the area of marriage and divorce. In fact, we can find this in Matthew 19 and some other places, so Jesus is asked there about divorce. And he says, well, in the beginning. He goes back to the garden. Interestingly here, Paul, back in chapter 5, touches on the issue of the sin that came in the garden. Well, Jesus would say, because of our hardness of hearts, Moses permitted divorce for certain reasons, particularly, specifically, exclusively for infidelity. Those who were in different camps, some would say that a rabbi would teach, well, you can marry for this reason or that reason. Some would say you can marry for really anything. If you didn't like the way your wife cooked food, if you just had issues with her, well, you could divorce her. And Jesus says, well, it wasn't that way in the beginning. That's not how God created it. And I want us to understand the importance of God's design, God's creation, God's plan. Well, here Moses is being referenced regarding the Mosaic law, and where Paul is saying that even in that law, you know that as Jews, you were taught and you grew up understanding that you were bound to your spouse as long as that spouse was living. But if that spouse was to pass away, that you are no longer bound by law to that husband or to that wife. Notice verse 2. For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living, she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. This is something that these Jewish Christians knew, because they are those, as Paul references, they are those who know the law. Okay, these weren't Gentile Christians who maybe are new to the Old Testament, the old law. They knew it. And so Paul is using this example here to use an illustration of how no longer are we bound to the old law. He mentioned that in chapter 6. And maybe in another way too, we are no longer bound to sin. But in specifically here, the old law, the 10 Commandments, and the broader aspects of the law of Moses. In 2013, Sergeant First Class Joseph Gant was laid to rest in California. But it was a bit unusual for a military man to be laid to rest in the context of those who were being laid to rest in that year, or the years prior, You see, and the reason is because Mr. Gant served in World War II and the Korean War. And he had gone missing in action during the Korean War. He was MIA, and there was no word about him. The North Koreans, even after the armistice was signed, had no record of him whatsoever to report back to the United States military. And so his wife, Clara, had no peace in understanding and knowing what had happened to her husband, Joseph. So every year she would wait for the return of her husband. She, in her mind, she was still married to him, even though there was a chance that he most likely had been killed in action. She continued to hold out hope that maybe he had been taken prisoner, which he had been, but he had later been executed. In fact, she even bought a house, waiting for his return, so that he could come home and live in this house. And she even hired a professional landscaper to do all the landscaping and all the yard work, so that when he got home, he didn't have to do any of that, that he could just go fishing, because that's what he liked to do. Well, it would be decades later, to where in 2013, his remains were found and sent back to the United States. And there was a ceremony, a funeral for him, and Miss Clara was still alive at this time. She was 94 years old. And she was asked by a reporter about all these things, and she expressed, her love and undying, if you will, commitment to him still as her husband. And she even said that when he went off to war, that he told her, if anything were to happen to me, I want you to remarry. She said, I responded to him by saying, no, that'll never happen. She said, here I am, all these years later, still married to him, waiting for the day that my Lord will call me home and I can be with him. See, in her mind, they were still bound, even though her husband, because she did not know that he had been passed. Now, this, in what Paul is saying here, is going to use again this illustration that you are bound to your spouse as long as they are alive. Well, spiritually speaking and doctrinally speaking, we are those who have died to that old law. Notice verse 4. Therefore, my brethren, you also were made to die through or to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another. Pause. How is it that we as Christians have died spiritually? Through baptism. We have died to sin, but we've also died to the old law, and if we were ever bound by that, but also to any law that we might have been holding ourselves to, the law of the Gentiles, if you will, which Paul has touched on as well. But this specifically has reference to that old Mosaic law. So we were made to die to the law through the body of Christ, which we are joined with in the waters of baptism. Notice, so that you might be joined to another. Okay, yes. Remember, if there's been the death of one spouse, you can now be joined to another in the eyes of God. The same is true spiritually here. Well, who is it now that we have died to the old law that we are joined to? Jesus. So that we can be joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God. Now he's getting into a bit of the purpose. Now we have been joined to another, that is Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. And the purpose, the reason, is so that we can bear fruit for God. He is making a case here that before we were joined to Jesus, we really and truly were not bearing any fruit for God. That's a hard thing to really grasp and in some ways accept. There are, again, many good people who do good things in the world. But is it truly bearing fruit for God if it's not in the body of Jesus? 4, verse 5, while we were in the flesh, this is before we've been joined to Jesus, the sinful passions which were through the law were at work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. This is more elaboration on what he spoke about there at the end of chapter 6, to where, again, before we had died to sin and been raised with Jesus, we were bearing fruit towards things that led to more sin and more death. But now that we've been joined to Jesus, we are bearing fruit to things that lead to life through our sanctification, through that growing process spiritually. And so, verse 6, now we have been released from the law, having died to that by which we were bound, so that we serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. This is a concept that Paul uses in different places. The idea of the old law and the letter, the written on stone component of it, versus now the Spirit of Christ, the grace that comes through Jesus, and the Spirit that is involved in it. And so this really is talking about Jesus, the newness of this new law, which is bound up in the Spirit of Jesus the Christ. But our binding, and to remember this, that we have now died with Jesus and we are no longer bound, which we were bound to sin, bound to the old law. It is no longer, but we are now bound to Jesus Christ, truly bound to Jesus Christ. And we made that commitment. We joined Jesus when we decided and obeyed the gospel through our faith. And we have been united with him. And so the binding, number one. The second component is the benefit. So, okay, Paul, and again, remember, Paul, being a former Jew, is understanding the Jewish mindset here, that these people, these Christians, his brothers and sisters, are thinking in their minds and the questions that they would come up with. And so he's knowing that they are going to be wondering, well, what good is the law then at all? What's the point of it? Why did God even give it? What value? Was it totally worthless then? Why did we live our lives following it or trying to keep it? What is the benefit? Well, Paul's going to say exactly what that benefit is in one way in verses 7 through 13. So what shall we say then, verse 7? Is the law sin? Did it really cause us to sin? Is it sinful inherently? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin. Now here it is. Okay, here's the benefit of the law as Paul is going to describe it here in Romans 7. So what's the benefit? I would not have come to know about sin if not for the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. This is interesting because it raises a question of, was sin in the world before the law? Could people know that they were sinning? Did sin exist? Well, absolutely. We already heard Paul talk about how sin entered the world through the sin of Adam, and death through sin, and it passed on to all men, even upon those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam, and death reigned from Adam until Moses, until the coming of the law. Why? Because of sin. And sin entering in the world, and others sinning in their own way. Now the difference is that when the law of Moses came, God laid it out as to the consequences of sin and specific sins that he could not and did not accept. Of course, he doesn't accept any sin, but he's going to give a bit of clarification on what sin really and truly looks like and what it is. And we understand the 10 Commandments, right? But there's so much more than that. The 10 Commandments did not exist when Adam sinned or when Abraham sinned. They didn't exist until Moses was given those commandments on Mount Sinai. It's also interesting that Paul says, I would not have known about coveting unless the law had said, you shall not covet. Many thoughts out there that would stress that in the Jewish mind and in Jewish theology and practice, coveting was one of the worst sins and one of the gravest problems of sin in the lives of people. That it really was the root of all other sin in most capacities. I got to thinking about that. And I can see why they might have that thinking. Consider it. What is coveting? It's wanting something that you don't have. And wanting it so much that you are willing to do almost anything to get it. Coveting. What was the sin of Adam and Eve? Well, they ate from the tree that God told them not to eat, but why did they eat it? It looked good to the eyes. It looked beneficial. It was something they didn't have. They could eat from anything in the garden, just not this one tree. Isn't it somewhat of our human, fleshly, sinful nature that we grow into to want things that we don't have? Whether it can be another person in a relationship way, or it can be something that we just covet that somebody else has, or that maybe a store has, or maybe a boss has, as was spoken about earlier, that we feel that whether we deserve it or not, we simply want it. You can look at when the Israelites went into the promised land in the book of Joshua. And in Joshua chapter 7, the sin of Achan is revealed. Similarly, God told them, when you go into this land and you conquer these people, I'm going to give you so much, but I just don't want you to take this or take that. Achan couldn't resist himself. And when he is confronted about it, he replies by saying, when I saw with my eyes, when I saw the treasure, then I wanted it and I took it. And he took it back to his camp and his tent, and he buried it. And it impacted, in different ways, but in similar ways as well, those around him. It impacted his family. The sin of Adam impacted not just his family, but all others as well. There's a side note here in that those with this idea that we have died to the old law, and now we are still to maybe keep some of it, the Sabbatarians, if you will, that would say that, well, we still must keep the 10 Commandments. We still must keep the Sabbath. And they would say that, well, you can really, that which we are no longer bound to is the ceremonial aspects of the law. Marty's got a great teaching on this on YouTube. And so, but this, Paul is speaking directly about the 10th commandment. He's saying we're no longer bound to this. This is a great place to go to if there's questions about, are we still supposed to keep the old law, the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath, and on and on. Notice what he continues to say, verse 8, but sin, so this is really how it came about then. So the law showed him what sin and coveting was, and sin taking opportunity through the commandment. His own fleshly sinful nature produced in me coveting of every kind, for apart from the law, sin is dead. Again, this is more of just the transgression component of it. Sin did exist before the law, but it wasn't spelled out and explained out. And the consequences, perhaps, of each and every different type of sin. I once was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive and I died. Spiritually speaking, this is Paul talking about his own experience, his own downfall with sin and allowing it to enter into his life. He was saying before, this is maybe, perhaps, what we would consider the age of accountability. maybe Paul is talking about that here, to where he's saying, look, there was a time in my life where I didn't know the law. I was a young little whippersnapper, and I didn't know the law. I hadn't really been taught to keep it yet. And so I was alive. I was spiritually alive with God. But when the commandment fully made sense to me, it was made known to me to not covet or to not do this or not be an idolater, then at some point I broke it. And I died. I was then severed from my Creator. All of us experience that at some level, at some point. We are not born sinful. We are born pure and righteous in the eyes of God. But at some point, and again, we think about coveting and what it can lead us to do, and can create greed in our hearts and desires, and again, whatever it might be. There was a time when I was a teenager where I was with some friends of mine, and we had gone to a grocery store. It's Dillon's in my hometown. It's connected with Kroger, if you're familiar with Kroger. And we went in there, and this was before the tobacco products were behind the counter, behind the glass cases, and I could reach them if I wanted to. Now, I didn't smoke. I didn't use tobacco. I didn't smoke. But they were right there. And for some reason, I reached out and grabbed a pack of cigarettes and I put it in my pocket. Now, mind you, I was not a Christian at this point. This is many years before I would turn to God. But again, I'd never stolen anything in my life up to this point. And I didn't even need those. I didn't smoke. Why did I do it? Because it was something I didn't have. And it was really just this, I guess, sudden rush and desire in me that I wanted that which I didn't have. I coveted those pack of cigarettes. Now, I got caught. There was workers that saw me, and there were consequences that would come. But thankfully, there was an advocate for me, my friend who worked there. I almost got him fired. He didn't get fired, but he vouched for me, and I gave the cigarettes back, and they didn't call the police. But sin can take opportunity through that. I knew it was wrong. Of course I knew it was wrong. But I did it anyway. And so what's the benefit of the law? Well, it teaches us what sin is and what the consequences of sin are. In another letter, Paul would write that the law was a teacher or a tutor which is bringing us to Jesus. It really is teaching us the need, if you will, for the grace of God. The need that we have to let grace reign, because if we don't have grace, we are all doomed. So that's the benefit of the law. In fact, later in this letter, he's going to say those things which were written before times were for our benefit. And we will see that and hopefully touch on that later. The third and final component is the battle. Verses 14 through 25. The collective and personal battle that exists all around and within each and every one of us. Verse 14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. He says, for what I am doing I do not understand, for I am practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So now no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. The battle. It is a spiritual battle. We stressed this last week, that we must admit and accept and confess and understand and live in such a way that we know that there is a spiritual fight going on all around us. And this is in a collective sense, as we said. This same apostle would write to the church in Ephesus and the end of that letter saying that our battle is not against flesh and blood. Consider that. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but he would say it's against the principalities, those dark forces of evil, of Satan. So all these things that we're seeing around us, especially the last handful of years, and they seem to not make sense. Like, how could this be? How can people fall for this? How can they say this? How can they practice this? Why is this happening? The only logical answer is because of the demonic element and the fight, the spiritual fight that does exist. And if we think it's something else, we are fooling ourselves and allowing ourselves to be deceived. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. And so that's what he says, to go on and put on the full armor of God. And there are other scriptural examples of this. You think about Elijah when he was confronted with those enemy forces and the prophet there exposed to his servant, the spiritual forces that were all around. And so there are spiritual forces that are working right alongside and maybe through at times the physical forces that we do see. To what extent, we don't know, but God does. But they are working and they are real. Daniel shows us that when he was visited by one of the archangels, Michael, and says that I was off fighting the prince of Persia. Spiritual battle that maybe was manifesting itself in a physical way. Paul's second letter to our brethren in Corinth. We saw this recently on a Wednesday night, to where the God of this age is blinding the eyes of the unbelieving so that they are failing and not being able to see the grace of God in the gospel message. Satan is blinding the eyes in a collective way of so many because they have refused to turn to the Lord and have a proverbial veil lifted over their eyes. Later in that same letter, he says that Satan, note this, Satan has his own angels, his own servants, his own messengers that are not only working demonic evil ways and doing demonic and evil things, but yes, they disguise themselves as angels of light. Are we susceptible to that deception? The answer is absolutely. And that is part of the battle. But of course, there is the individual battle as well, that each and every one of us faces. It's perhaps similar to what Peter would speak about, to where how Satan is prowling around as a lion, a ravenous, roaring lion waiting to devour each and every one of us. And he works to attack us individually. Individually. You know, we saw right after the fall of man where they were kicked out of the garden, to where Cain and Abel, God told Cain that if you do good, you'll be fine. But if you don't, then Satan, sin, is waiting right outside your door. Your door, Cain. To devour you. There is an individual battle that we all face. Spiritually. Against sin. Against the forces of evil and darkness. Paul is touching on that here. Now, for centuries, this passage has been debated and questioned and discussed and studied as to what really is Paul talking about here with regard to when this spiritual struggle with sin he was experiencing. Was it before he was a Christian? Many good arguments for that. Was it now as he is a Christian? Many good arguments for that as well. One good argument for the latter is that the present tense terminology that he is using, as where he had just spoke about past, for we have died to the law, but now he says, for what I am doing currently, I'm doing what I don't know. Why do I do it? Wretched man that I am, he would say, verse 24. Who will set me free from the body of this death? Now, if he is perhaps talking about his current struggle as a disciple of Jesus, is he saying that it's okay to sin and that I can't do anything about my sin and that I should just succumb to living in sin? Absolutely not. And we can know that without question because just a few sentences earlier in the last chapter, he said the exact opposite. Right? Do you remember? For how shall we who died to sin still live in it? And he goes on to speak of not allowing the members of our body to be used as weapons of unrighteousness, but now righteousness, to fight this battle. For we are not under law, but under grace. Wretched man that I am. Notice verse 22 and 23. It says, for I joyfully concur with the law. And Paul's saying, look, the law exposed my sin, but I don't have problem with the law. The problem was with my sinful nature. And maybe to one question as well regarding, was this in his past? I think Paul was a spiritual person before he became a Christian. He tried his best to keep the law and follow God. Now we know that he executed Christians and arrested Christians, and that was one of his greatest faults, but he thought he was doing good. He was zealous for God and following the law. He was a great Pharisee, a teacher of the law. So Paul doesn't have a problem with the law. He understands the problem is with his self and with his flesh and with the corruption that sin has caused in his life and continues to struggle with. But I see a different law, verse 23, in the members of my body waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. For those who are Christians, and maybe you've been for years and years, have there been times to where you, of course, you know what God wants you to do, but as was mentioned earlier, you fail to do it? Or you do the very thing that you know you shouldn't be doing? Or that you've done something and you think, man, why did I do that? Why did I speak to my wife that way? Why did I have that thought? Why do I allow these images to come into my mind? And I think Paul, even if he was one who followed Christ to his best abilities, and he was one who would tell others, follow my example. Okay? And I think that's something we can look at too when it comes to this current possibility of Paul saying his struggle with sin. Maybe I think he did, but he still believed he was somebody who tried to follow Jesus' example as best he could. And he would even tell Timothy, so follow my example. You did follow my example, and you're continuing to do that and keep doing that. But Paul still understood that he was broken. He still understood that if he did not continue on that path, that there could come a day where he would completely be severed from God again because he could still fall from grace if he allowed sin to overcome his life. And so that's why Paul stressed over and over again the need and the importance of striving to live holy and follow Jesus and to distance oneself from those sinful things of the world, like he would say in Ephesians chapter 5, of those things of darkness. Notice this, Ephesians 5, beginning in verse 3. He would say, but immorality or any impurity or greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. This just came right after he said, be imitators of God as beloved children. So be imitators of God. And so do away with the immorality, the impurity, the greed. Do you ever have any bit of greed in your life at times? This is a good time to self-reflect on our own struggles with the battle that we have. And so there must be no filthiness and silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For you know this with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man, there's covetousness again, who is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words. I don't know about you, but it's easy for me at times to point the finger, especially at people in the world, and even at other brethren at times, but especially people of the world, right? Look how ungodly they are. You know, I don't murder people. I don't commit adultery. I don't steal anymore, at least. I don't. And there's so much going on in our world that is truly, truly evil and ungodly. And from just changing the order of God's creation, we can think about this in so many ways, from our medicines to our food to what we're doing to our children. It is evil and demonic. It really, truly is. And it's easy to point those fingers and say, those people are so sinful. But how often am I pointing that finger back at myself and saying, wretched man that I am, while I still strive to do better each and every day, and I pray that God gives me strength to do that, and think about these other ways. Again, there are some things that just seem so gross and awful and ungodly and evil that we would never do them. But can we sin in other ways? Is it still sin in God's eyes? Remember what Paul had already said, for there are none righteous, not even one. For all have fallen short of God's glory. And so let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. So therefore, do not be partakers with them. For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord, so walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, knowing what is pleasing to the Lord. And so we strive to please God by doing fruits of light and righteousness and bearing it, and this battle that we in. And that's one way that we fight this battle, is by doing good. But remembering the need that we have for the grace of God. But as Paul is stressing so much here, God's grace is not a license to sin. In fact, it should bring the opposite into our lives. But nonetheless, wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of death? Paul knew that no matter how much he tried to keep the law, no matter how badly he wanted to be a follower of God and to do good, he needed to be set free, and he could never do that. It would take somebody else. You know, we'll end with this. And there was a time when I was just a couple years younger than that time I went into that grocery store and did this, where I found myself in need of deliverance that I could not give. I was with my sister, and I was over at my dad's house, and for whatever reason, I convinced her that it was a good idea to allow me to be folded up into a futon bed. So she put me in there and she folded it up. Well, she wasn't strong enough to lift it up with me inside of it. I was stuck. My dad was at work. She tried to go get my stepsister. She wasn't strong enough to lift it, and so they had to call my dad to come home from work to get me out of this bed. I have claustrophobia, so I thought I was done. I really did. And needless to say, I was stressing out quite a bit. I did not like being in that situation. About a decade later, I found myself in an even worse situation in which I knew that there was no way out of this on my own. You see, I was in jail. I was in county jail because of alcohol. And I was sitting there and I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And unfortunately, it had happened before, so this wasn't the first time that I had been sitting in jail because of alcohol. And so there were two components to this. The first was I knew I could not get out of this situation without my parents coming and bailing me out once again. And so I made that shameful call to them, not knowing if they were going to bail me out this time. But somewhere in my heart, I knew my mom loved me and that she probably would. And they did. They made the 2-hour drive to come and save me and get me out of that. But there was also another realization that I had at that time, that I needed something else in my life to truly get me out of that situation. And at this time, I was not a believer in Jesus. I had barely come to accept that God has to exist. And it was at that moment that I got on my knees in that jail floor and in that jail cell, and I prayed to whatever God that I was praying to, saying, Lord, I don't know, who you are or what you are. I know you exist, and I promise you that if and when I get out of here, that I am going to dedicate my life to following you, because I understand how broken I truly am and wretched man that I am. And that this life is no life. It continues to get me in these situations and in these positions, and realizing that I was on a path of either spending a lot of time in a place like that, or killing myself, or even worse, killing somebody else because of my stupid decisions. And that only God could save me and get me out of that. And I prayed a lot and thought about, should I even bring this up? And there have been times in a congregation in past where I have mentioned this account and story, and later it was held against me. And saying, well, maybe you're doing some of those same things again, Jesse. And, maybe people, and they looked differently upon me because of who I used to be. But you know what? Through my prayer and my thought about this, for one, Paul, who once was Saul, but had died to that old self through the waters of baptism and been raised again to now be the man Paul, was once who had even been responsible and the ringleader for killing Christians, followers of Jesus. I had never done that. Now, I ridiculed and I mocked and I debated and maybe tried to turn others' faith away. Shame on me. But I never killed Christians. I had simply done things that could have killed innocent people by my actions. Thank God I never did that. But who will set me free? Who would set Paul free? And the truth is that man, that former person that was in that cell, is dead and gone. And a new man came up out of the waters that day in Guthrie, Oklahoma. And I am not perfect. I still mess up. You ask my wife, she could probably tell you many, many ways in which I do. But thanks be to God, verse 25, through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh, the law of sin. And this is the battle. It is trying to overcome our flesh every day. And we must be conscious of that. And we must be focused on it and realize that it is indeed a daily battle. And we all have different experiences and things that can cause us to want to revert back to the flesh in our own way. So how? How do we overcome this? How do we overcome the flesh with the Spirit? Well, we're going to see a little bit next week, Lord willing, as to where Paul speaks about giving into the Spirit and being led by the Spirit rather than the flesh. I'd like to finish with going back to Ephesians chapter 5, to where that passage where it says, to not be a part of that or partakers of that immorality or any impurity, and do not participate in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. And he says, all things will become visible when they are exposed by the light. We are the light. That becomes visible is light. For everything that does is light. And he says, for this reason, it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So be careful how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. Redeeming the time. Our time is short, folks. It really is. Even if we live to be 120, our time is short. Because the days are evil. So then, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation. Now here we go. So what do we do? What can we take with us? How do we let grace reign? How do we overcome the flesh? It's all those things that he just said, okay? Avoiding those things, not filling our lives with those things, but filling our lives with the things of the Spirit. That's what he says next. But be filled up in spirit. So how do we do that? How do we do that? There are three ways that Paul gives here of how we can be filled up with the Spirit and spiritual things in our lives. The first is through our worship, our praise, our songs, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. One of the most obvious ways is what we do here on the first day of the week. Joseph gave an excellent devotional the other day and expanding on this and how there are other ways that we can do this too, through our Wednesday nights, through our other studies that we have. But there is truly something about singing and praising God in song. And think about that. And so what is it maybe that would prevent us from engaging in this and participating in this, even in worship services? There was a time where I thought singing was silly. I had too much pride, perhaps, too much ego to allow myself to give over to God and sing praises to Him. I don't want to look silly, right? But I was hindering my spiritual growth. I was hindering my spiritual filling. You can do this at your own home by doing family devotionals in your home with your family, by singing songs. Even if, again, I exhibit A of not being a great song leader, but we do this in our home. We try to do it every day. We fail sometimes, sure. But we then do it maybe the next day, or the next day, and then the next day. This helps us remember who God is. It helps us be closer together. It helps us be spiritual as a family, individually and collectively. The same is true with regard to praising Him in our prayers, in our writings. The Psalm 103 that was read by Colin, and speaking of bless the Lord, O my soul. All the reasons we have to bless and praise God. So the first is, again, through our praise and our worship, our songs. And if you're single or widowed or widower, then, again, look for opportunities to do this with others throughout the week. There are so many with technology. It's a blessing and a curse. But you can find there's a cappella songs. There are lessons that you can listen to 24 hours a day. The second component that Paul says there in Ephesians 5, that the way we are filled up in spirit, and again, is it the way we are, or is it the result of? Maybe it's both. But the second is through the giving of thanks. In all things, he says, give thanks. Give thanks. Consider that. if we are able to give thanks, and this was obviously last week with the holiday, something that we were focused on for days and days, rightfully so. But if we are able to give thanks in all things, at all times, for what God has done, and writing this down, praying it, what it can do to help us overcome the flesh and be filled up in spirit. And then the third way is submitting to one another. This was a big part of our Bible class. Submitting to one another. And there in the rest of chapter 5 and into chapter 6, he gives those categories of wives submitting to your husbands, husbands loving your wives, children obeying your parents, fathers raising up your children, masters and slaves rightfully and equally submitting to one another as to the Lord. So our submission to the Lord is displayed through our submission to one another. And we'll tie this in and we'll finish right here. Through God's design, especially within the family unit. Why is there so much turmoil? Why is there so much ill health in our world and in our country today? It's because we have just totally hijacked God's design in a lot of ways. Well, the same can be true with our spiritual health as well, in thinking of what is the family structure that God has designed. If we are able to do that and fulfill God's purpose through that, we will be filled up more in the Spirit and be able to walk in the light and not walk in that darkness as God has called us to do, and which we must and need to do to win this fight and to let grace reign. Scott chose a song for us to have as a song of encouragement or even invitation for if you would like or need, prayers to talk to somebody, and this is something too that we were talking about yesterday. It's been a while since I've seen somebody come forward and ask for anything like that. It does happen on occasion, but truth is a lot of us, probably most of us, if not all of us, at different times need that exact encouragement and exhortation and prayer. But we're too either prideful or shy or embarrassed or don't want judgment from others because we're not giving grace to one another to do that. And so if you find yourself in that place today and you don't feel comfortable coming forward, please reach out to somebody and call them, text them, say, hey, you know what, I need prayers for this, or I'd like to talk to you about this, or I'm struggling with this, because the battle is real, and we care about you, and that's what we want most of all, is for us all to get the help we need and to let grace reign. Let us now stand and sing.